I'm going to start out this series with an old traditional design named the Underground Railroad. When you look at this block, it looks very, very complicated, and we're going to take a look closely at the quilt on the back wall. When you study it, you'll see that there's a strong diagonal line created by half-square triangles, and those would be the darkest half-square triangles. And they intersect with each other, and you'll notice too that all of the half-square triangles in each block have a different group of prints in them. Then to create an even stronger effect in the quilt, I used a blue diagonal square and a red one, and they intersect in a square that sits on point. And I have to agree that when you look at it, it looks like a very complicated quilt, but a little later I'm going to show you the simplicity in putting it together. Also, you'll notice that there is a square sitting horizontal in the quilt. And this is one of the main parts, as well as the square that sits on point. To do the final touches of this quilt, I'm really lucky because I have such a wonderful staff to help with this part of it. Faith Mills created the elongated feather that sits on the dark half-square triangles, and that surrounded the square that sits on point. Also, she created a continuous line medallion that fits over the other intersection. Then Jean Brown did all of the machine quilting on a long arm machine, and she did a beautiful job with all of Faith's designs. And I forgot to mention earlier that all of the piecing was done by Judy Block. And these are all staff people that we have back at Quilting from the Heartland, and I feel so lucky to have them as part of our group. And I promised you earlier that I would show you the simplicity of this block. Believe it or not, there are only two shapes that are used to create this whole pattern. We have a half-square triangle, and that was used for the dark and the light half-square triangles that go through the pattern. And the other simple shape that was used was just a simple square. And these templates come from a template set called the Quilter Starter Kit, which you'll hear us refer to so often throughout the whole series. Next, I want you to take a look at the group of fabrics that I have down in front of me. I have divided the fabrics into actually 4 different groups. We have the lighter group of fabrics over here, and of course it looks like I don't know how many different prints, but I wanted this quilt to look as scrappy as it possibly could. And then I used a darker group of fabrics for the large half-square triangles, and then the medium prints I used in the rest of the areas where I needed to create a pattern. And to make the recipe work together, I blended in these two fabrics, the strong red and the blue, which created a diagonal path throughout the quilt. And these are all reproduction Civil War prints. Next, I think I'm going to show you how I do some cutting, and ahead of time I have pre-cut a strip of fabric, and I have bifolded it up on top of a small mat board. And that makes it possible for me to turn as I'm cutting around the shapes. Ahead of time, I have put fabric grips on the back side of the templates, and that will keep them from sliding when I'm cutting. Lay the template down on top of the fabric that was already cut, and the proper way to hold your cutter is to put the pointer finger up on top of the cutter rather than holding on to it like this. And I find so often when I'm teaching classes, if somebody is having trouble with the rotary cutter, that's probably what they've done wrong. Now we have got the first half-square triangle cut, and to save fabric, we will just flip that template in the opposite direction, and we will automatically have perfect shapes that include the 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I think that's all the cutting that I need to demonstrate, because there's a lot of sewing that I want to talk about a little bit later on. But before we go to the sewing machine, I want to show you the first blocks that I was working on when starting with this pattern, and I want to point out some things that I did wrong with it. First of all, when you look at it, you do see the strong diagonal path with the half square triangles going through it. But you don't see a strong path going through here. And so visually, it wasn't quite as effective. What you do see in what I did in my first blocks, that you'll see once in a while a red square pops out. And that's what gave me the idea to lay down a red path diagonally going through here. And I don't have enough squares up here to go the whole way across, but doesn't that look a lot better already? And that also gave me the idea that maybe in the opposite direction than if I did this, I would be a lot more pleased with the pattern when I was finished. Well, after I had laid those two fabrics down, I took another look at my collection that I had started with, and automatically I realized that I was no longer able to use the red for my half square triangles as well as the blue over here. They just didn't seem to work anymore. The other thing that I want to show you before we start sewing is that this isn't the only way to arrange the blocks after you've put them together. And look at what happens when you start turning these blocks. You end up with another whole different quilt just by turning two of the blocks 90 degrees. And I'm not sure what effect we would get by doing some of the other things, and that's something you can play with. But that's what you do in all types of quilting, is after you've made several of the blocks, you play with them and see what you can do with them. Well, I'm so excited because earlier Lauren Carell was here with us, and he showed me the new ergonomic equipment that I was going to use throughout the series. As I travel across the country, I have met many quilters who have some of the same discomforts in the sewing area that I do. And about a year ago, I found the Ergonomic Advantage products, and here to tell us about it today is Lauren Carell.
Hi, Charlene.
Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Just what is ergonomics?
Well, Charlene, essentially, ergonomics is the science of making the world fit you instead of making your body fit your environment. It's all about being more comfortable when you quilt and sew.
And that's exactly what I've experienced.
Charlene, ergonomic products can actually eliminate the discomfort of sewing and allow you to sew longer and enjoy it more.
And what is the first thing that you're going to show us?
Well, Charlene, let's start with the position of your feet when you sew.
Okay.
Most people who sew have one foot out in front and the other foot tucked back under their chair so they can balance the weight sitting out on the front edge of a hard surface kitchen chair. Well, pretty soon the front foot is chasing the foot pedal, and it puts your body in a very awkward position.
Now, I like to sew with my shoes off. Is that okay?
Absolutely, Charlene.
Okay.
Make yourself comfortable.
Okay, so I'll put that one up there first.
Let's take a look at the SureFoot system. The grooved rubber surface on the non-slip floor mat anchors that foot pedal in place, and the wedge-shaped rest is for your free foot, so that balances the weight equally on your hips.
Okay, so I'll put my other foot up there, and now we're ready to go to the chair.
Now you're ready to lean back and enjoy the comfort and support of the perfect sewing chair. It's adjustable to the right height for your sewing table. That's probably a little better for you.
Yes.
And this lever releases the seat pan angle to give you the best support for your legs and hips.
I like it about there because I don't feel any pressure here.
That's good. This knob releases the back panel so we can bring the built-in lumbar support up to the small of your back. And there's one more adjustment, and when we release this lever, we're able to move the back panel to be in the best position for your sewing. More upright when you're at your machine, or it reclines quickly when you want to sit back to do hand sewing and lap work.
Now I feel it's very nice support back there.
Well, now that your feet are out in front and your weight's balanced on your hips and you've got a good adjustable chair, you're ready for the third piece of the
Yes.
comfort sewing system. We have your sewing machine on a tiltable, Charlene. The tiltable brings the view of the sewing needle to you so you can lean back and avoid the upper back, neck, and shoulder discomfort that's commonly associated with sewing.
And also with bifocals, it makes it a lot easier.
Yes,
it brings the sewing area right to you. And as I'm sewing now, I don't have to reach over to see. It's brought it right to me.
It gives you a much better view of the sewing needle and more control.
And as I'm sewing, I don't have to think about anything now but my sewing, and I'm comfortable. And you know, Lauren, to be honest, I didn't used to spend hours at the sewing machine without getting up and walking around. Now I can do it as long as I need to, and I don't have any discomfort at all. Thank you so much for sharing this product with us.
Charlene, you're welcome.
Now we're ready to go to the sewing machine and start putting these blocks together, and it's so nice to be able to transfer them to the sewing area on the flannel board. That way the pieces won't get mixed up during the sewing process. As you can see, it would be easy to get confused if you didn't do it that way. When you take a look at the pattern up here, again, just a little bit of review. Notice the strong half square triangles going here, and then we want to maintain this diagonal pattern with the little blue squares through here. The first thing that we're going to do is put these two units together, and then we'll make the square unit that sits up in there. Right sides together. And I'm not going to use pins because I find that sometimes they get in my way. I will place them right under the presser foot, and I'm going to sew with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. And notice that I'm going to use a stiletto to guide the fabric in front of the presser foot. Also, I'm using an open toe foot to do my sewing. That way I have an unobstructed view of the needle and what's going on as I sew. Also, when you use a stiletto like this, it guarantees that you won't have a wavy stitch at the end, because there's no way you can get your pointer finger up there to the final stitches like you can the stiletto. After you've sewn some of those together, and I had already sewn some, this would be called chain sewing. Also notice that I didn't do any back stitching when I was sewing those units together. Now we're ready to finger press those units open. And when you finger press, you want to do that on a hard surface. If you do it on the ironing board, your pointer finger will sink in to the ironing board and you don't have as good a press. Then again, do it on the other one, right side and wrong side. And then you're ready to press with the iron. And I like to keep the iron right close to me so I don't have to get up and down during the process of putting the block together. Now I'm going to turn the 2 half square units, but you know what I need to do before I do that is make sure that I have passed my sewing test. And when I lay the template down on top of those pieces sewn together, if those 2 squares equal the rectangle, then I know that I have the perfect scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. The scant 1/4 inch seam allowance just makes up for the amount of fabric that's used in the seam line. Well, now that I have passed the sewing test, I'm going to show you one of the different ways that I do use to pin those intersections together. One of my favorite methods is to put a pin right on the seam line, 1/4 of an inch from the edge through the top, and then send that pin 1/4 of an inch through the bottom on the bottom piece, and let that pin stand upright. That pin actually will be pulled out before I sew the seam. The next pin will go in one on each side of that standing pin. And if you only want to use one pin, you can use just the one that goes under the presser foot first. Then remove the standing pin, and now we'll be ready to sew that unit together, and we will end up with what's called a simple 4-patch. Slide the pieces under the presser foot, and again guiding with the stiletto, I will have that perfect seam allowance. And as I come up to this intersection, I slow down when I approach the pin, pull it out, and I will sew to the end of this seam. Now, most of the time when I'm sewing, I like to have an anchor cloth to sew off to at the end or the beginning. That way I don't have to waste thread, and it also saves a lot of time. Now we will have our first 4-patch that will go into this Underground Railroad block. And again, notice the intersection in the center, how perfect it is because I pinned it that way. Now the next thing I'm going to do is finger press that seam open, and I do this on all quilts if it's at all possible. I find that my quilts lay a lot flatter if I do it that way. Something that I teach beginners to do is, even though they have passed that first sewing test, they have a second chance to take a sewing test, and they'll lay the square then up on top of those 4 pieces sewn together, and if they feel that that is perfect, then they're ready to continue on. If the square is too big for the template, you can cheat and trim off a little bit on the outside edge. But the main point is that you want that 4-patch to be exactly the same size as the square. And it takes a little extra time, but I can tell you it's worthwhile. Now the next thing that we're going to do is work with the half square units in this pattern, and I'll take a couple of those off. And shapes that are identical to each other are the easiest shapes to work with. And you just simply match up the corner down here, and you match up the points up in here. And again, I will just slide it under the presser foot and start sewing. Now this will be sewn on the bias, so I want to be careful that I don't stretch the fabric as I sew. Again, guiding the fabric up to the needle with the stiletto. I'm sewing with about 10 stitches per inch. I find that to be a very strong seam. Again, I'm not going to backstitch, and now we'll sew on to the next piece, which is called chain sewing. Chain sewing will save you an awful lot of time in the sewing room. Now, after we have sewn that seam, let me point out something here. I wasn't watching carefully enough what I had done, and you'll notice how that fabric has slipped a little bit, and so the 2 edges aren't perfectly matched up. Well, I have 2 options now. I can either rip out that seam and correct it, or I can do something else, and I'll show you what that is. I will lay this patchwork up on a little mat board that I can turn around easily at the sewing area. Finger press it down, and let's lay that template up on top of there. See, now I have saved that unit because I can trim off the extra fabric, and that way I don't have to pick out my stitches that I did wrong. And there you have the perfect square. Let's lay that down and make sure we have it pressed real nice and flat. And we're ready to put that back up onto the flannel board to create the pattern. Ahead of time here, I'll just continue. I'll pull this one off and I'll press it open. Now this one I didn't let the fabric slip on, so I'm not going to have to trim off any extra fabric. We'll press that down, and I won't take the time to trim off the ears, but now you can see how the block is already starting to come together. After you get all the little 4 patches and the half square triangles sewn together, you start connecting these into rows. So now right sides together, I will put this down, match up the corner down here, and we'll start sewing on our anchor cloth first. And the reason I like to do that is so that the first stitches sewn on the patchwork are then as strong as the middle stitches sewn in the seam. I think you can already tell that this is a very, very simple quilt to put together. You just have to remember a few simple things, and that is take the time to do accurate cutting. And then of course the flannel board is very, very important also when you put a block like this together, because you don't want to take more off the board at one time than you can put back in place. You don't want to forget where your place is. Okay, now after that seam is pressed open, I want to point out that this intersection is now 1/4 of an inch from the edge, and that is just exactly what we needed. Sure hope you enjoyed watching this quilt go together today.